guns, and money. Send lawyers, guns, and money.
Welcome back to Conduct Detrimental, episode 53, the Harry Carson number. Harry Carson, NFL, great Giant Hall of Famer. So welcome back to the episode. The NFL will be on the docket today, and I want to welcome in my hopefully long-time co-host, and I think we're on our 7th episode now, Dan Lust. How you doing, Dan?
I'm good, Dan. And you know what else we're welcoming back? Major League Baseball. That's back. We have our first game. I didn't know, Dan, you and I didn't know if we would get there. We have baseball back. How was your weekend on this lovely Sunday?
Oh, it was great. I mean, I'm living in South Carolina for the entire summer. You know, my COVID-19 protocol involves bailing on my home in South Florida, running away and living in the rural countryside in the northern part of South Carolina, where my neighbors consist of goats, horses, rabbits, and stray dogs. So everything is working out wonderfully from a COVID-19 perspective, knock on wood, thankfully. And, the only hitch is the Wi-Fi. So sometimes the Wi-Fi doesn't work so well. And I think 2 of our episodes have been compromised by technological problems on my end because my Wi-Fi signal isn't so strong. But everything's going well.
I don't know if you did that on cue, but just as you said the word Wi-Fi, you skipped like a little bit. So I think you have a little trick up your sleeve. I think it's selective Wi-Fi, Dan.
Yeah, no question. Listen, I'm living in West Union, South Carolina, population 215, and that includes all the stray animals. So you take your Wi-Fi as you find it, and next week I'm moving into a townhouse on the other side of the tracks, the nice side of town, and hopefully the Wi-Fi will cooperate. Hopefully everything went well for you this weekend. Did you have a nice time?
I did. A very good weekend. My wife has been binging Grey's Anatomy, all 21 seasons, so that has been not the greatest to sit through 21 seasons of a show, but neither here nor there, Dan. So just for everyone, we got a lot of good feedback from last week's episode. We crowdsourced the topics. Dan and I always have an idea of what we want to talk about, but just with the listenership growing, we wanted to open it up to you guys to see what you guys wanted to hear. So we decided, again, to do another guestless episode. I think people seem to have fun with this. And we asked Twitter, we asked Instagram, we asked our various channels, and we came back with a ton of topics. We have 7. We actually have 6 on the topic, 7 if we can get to one more. Okay, so with that being said, Dan, let us hit the first one. I will, as promised, I will give the shout outs. The first one was given to us by Dylan Harriger. He's a 2L at UNH Law School. Dylan's suggested topic is to talk about the different legal strategies from the attorney's perspective that the lawyers in the Baker Dunbar case took, as opposed to the Ed Oliver case. And as we know, the Ed Oliver case this past week was dismissed. That was a DWI and a weapons charge. And the Baker Dunbar case, that armed robbery case in the NFL, that does not appear to be going away anytime soon. And just a quick shout out to Dylan's the president and the founder of the newfound Student Sports Law Network. It's basically a student-run network for publications, podcasts. So Dylan organized this with a bunch of like-minded law students. So I serve as I guess they're unofficial advisors. So if anybody's trying to get in touch with those guys, I'm happy to give them a shout. So with that being said, Dan, what are your takes on the different legal strategies in the Baker Dunbar case versus the Ed Oliver case?
Oh, sure. But first, as to Dylan, you and I now have a connection at the University of New Hampshire School of Law. I'm actually a teacher there. I'm the co-founding director of their sports wagering and integrity program. I co-direct that with Michael McCann. I teach it remotely, and I can't say that I've seen Dylan around campus because I haven't been to campus. UNH is certainly at the epicenter of sports law with McCann, Wallach. So let's get back to Quentin Dunbar and DeAndre Baker. We're recording this episode one day before NFL training camps open. The Seattle Seahawks and the New York Giants both open their training camps on July 28th. We know who will be there, DeAndre Baker and Quentin Dunbar. But let's talk first about who won't be there. And that's Giants' erstwhile former Pro Bowl kicker, Aldrick Rosas, who was released earlier today by the New York Giants following, a month and a half ago. He was arrested for fleeing. It was a hit-and-run accident.
Yeah, messy hit-and-run.
What do you think about the Giants' decision to release a player facing misdemeanor charges while the Giants are taking no action with respect to a cornerback by the name of DeAndre Baker, who faces felony criminal charges allegedly involving the use of a firearm. How do you square those two situations?
I think it's pretty easy, Dan. I think Baker is a first-round pick, and I think Aldrick Rosas is a kicker who is much more easily replaceable. You don't necessarily have to agree with it. I mean, at the end of the day, armed robbery in the NFL, I've never heard of it. You would think that would be an action or a type of incident where a player would be more likely to be released or cut bait with. I know, Dan, you've been very vocal about what you think is going to happen to Baker in terms of the NFL example. So I want to make sure we hit that. In terms of Rosas, I mean, the Giants could have waited. It's obviously a 2018 Pro Bowl kicker with the Giants, but kickers are a dime a dozen. It's not like he's a first-round cornerback. I know there's, we've had different conversations about how Baker has been with the Giants in terms of his overall productivity, but it's still a first-round pick, and there's enough cloudiness around that lawsuit. Whereas, Dan, with the Aldrick Rosas case, the reports out there was that it was a literal bloody scene in this hit and run. They found Rosas covered in blood with a DWI. There's a lot more damning evidence against him. I think Baker and Dunbar, this is kind of mixed bag about the witnesses going back and forth. But at the end of the day, Dan, it's a first-round pick as a cornerback. So I hate to think that factored in, but I do think it did.
Yeah, well, you don't hear too many instances of teams trading draft capital to move up to grab a kicker. So that's clearly, right, one of the factors that are floating out there. But also from a salary cap perspective, and we're going to get to the issue of the exempt list shortly, but if the Giants cut DeAndre Baker tomorrow, there's going to be cap consequences associated with that. Whereas with Aldrick Rosas, his salary wasn't guaranteed, and the Giants could part ways with him without facing any adverse consequence from a cap perspective. Not so, however, with DeAndre Baker. And I think the Giants are essentially in a wait-and-see mode because the NFL is going to come into play very soon with its own, disciplinary actions potentially, possibly including placing Baker and Quinton Dunbar on the commissioner's exempt list, and then seeing how the criminal case plays out. And the Giants may be able to extricate themselves from the contract without any cap hit if the league disciplines him, suspends him. Maybe he's found guilty. So the Giants don't have to take any action now. But turning back to Rosas, even though it's only a misdemeanor as compared with the felony charges facing Dunbar and Baker, the evidence of criminality, as you pointed out, seems much more obvious on the surface. I mean, his hands, legs, and feet were covered in blood. He fled the scene on foot. They didn't give him a breathalyzer, but he has a prior DUI and a prior suspended license. And who runs from the scene, flees on foot, unless, maybe you've been drinking, and the time of the day, 8:20, 8:25 a.m. I don't think I could keep up with Aldrick Rosas. That's pretty early in the day to be drinking alcohol and then driving. So his situation in terms of obvious guilt is demonstrably worse than Baker's and Dunbar's, where all we have at this point are just witness statements and alleged videotape of witness bribery, which you think that's bad enough, but maybe it doesn't rise to the same level of what appears obvious in Aldrick Rosas's case.
You had me at covered in blood. I didn't need the running from the scene. I think that doesn't help his case. It's important. So I think to answer the call of the original question, which Dylan pointed out, which I think is interesting, I made a comment which I thought was an interesting one. Ed Oliver, who's another first-round pick for the Buffalo Bills, defensive tackle, 9th overall pick. Ed Oliver, right around the same time, is actually the same weekend. Dan, that was actually you're in my first podcast when that same weekend when Baker and Dunbar got in trouble, and Oliver. There's one more player I'm forgetting, but Oliver got pulled over for DWI and a weapons charge. They allegedly found a pistol in the back seat. We didn't really hear anything about Ed Oliver. His attorney didn't say anything. Ed Oliver didn't say anything about the case. Completely silent. I did see people online trying to figure out, and adjusting the Bills' odds in Vegas because Ed Oliver, their main defensive tackle, wasn't going to be there, and what the cap hit could be and what money he was going to forfeit. All valid questions, but we didn't hear anything from Oliver. So all of a sudden, fast forward really about 2 months to the day, and Ed Oliver's case is dismissed. His labs came back clean. And Oliver had a fun time, quote, retweeting some of these articles saying that he had this DWI and really flexing on them, dunking on them, whatever you want to call it, and just saying, it's funny to reread these articles now. No one knows what they're talking about. Innocent until proven guilty. And that's one strategy that you can take. Ed Oliver didn't say anything, let the legal path take its course. And at the end of the day, Oliver, I'm sure the Bills liked that strategy. No one thought about that case. Meanwhile, on the other end, Dan, and you kind of alluded to it, we've obviously hit this case a bunch. Baker's attorney, Dunbar's attorney are the story. Dunbar's attorney is the story right now. He had to withdraw from the case. Baker's attorney, one of them at least, is making guarantees like, again, here's our professional wrestling reference. We have to get one of them in. Like he's making his guarantee, like he's the Ayatollah of rock and roll of Chris Jericho for the Macho Man, late great Macho Man Randy Savage, guaranteeing a victory in court, and then it doesn't happen. Those are just two different strategies.
There you are showing our generational differences, because my reference would have been classy Freddie Blassie, 1970s, or maybe Captain Lou, or maybe, and I hate to say his name in light of all the recent events, but there was a character, wrestling manager called the Grand Wizard of Wrestling. He was actually called the Grand Wizard of Wrestling, and he was dressed like a guy from the KKK, and the WWF put that stuff out there in the 1970s. Just absolutely crazy.
That would not fly. I don't think that would fly now.
No,
I'm pretty sure.
He's deceased, so he won't be making a comeback. All those managers are deceased. But anyway, you mentioned Oliver's case. That's another case involving the use of a gun, which really ties very effectively into our new theme song, Lawyers, Guns, and Money. But just because Oliver's charges have been dropped, as we know from Article 46 of the Collective Bargaining Agreement and the Personal Conduct Policy, he may not be completely out of the woods, because the NFL doesn't necessarily treat the dismissal of a criminal case or the decision by prosecutors not to file charges as as prima facie evidence of innocence under the NFL's disciplinary system. So it's unlikely, but he may potentially face some consequences, from the NFL. But I want to focus on one last point, because while the Giants and the Seahawks are welcoming DeAndre Baker and Quinton Dunbar respectively to training camp within the next 24 hours, I don't think their tenure practicing for their teams is going to last very long, because there's the issue of the commissioner's exempt list looms very large in the background, and both of these players are facing very serious felony criminal charges involving the threat of force, the threat of violence, use of a firearm. Formal charges have been filed by prosecutors, or at least initial charges were filed, and these factors check all the boxes on the commissioner's exempt list under the 2016 personal conduct policy. And Roger Goodell has the right to, if one of these crimes of violence is suspected, to place either player temporarily, and we know how temporarily means in the NFL, because Adrian Peterson, I think, was on the exempt list for almost a full season. But both these players face the prospect of being tossed or placed on that list imminently. Dan, I have to ask you, do you see either or both of those players landing on the list? And if so, when?
I think it would be crazy if Baker and Dunbar played a game with this looming over them. I just can't in my head see it, to the extent that there are obviously allegations at the end of the day. This would not be a good look if they turned out to get hit with these charges. I mean, it's armed robbery. I hate to make a comparison, but there have been DWI cases in NFL history. I mean, we've seen that. You and I joked in a previous podcast that the only thing that maybe closely resembled, the Baker Dunbar situation was maybe Plexico Burress. When thinking about it, maybe Ray Lewis. You just don't, when these charges are floating over their head, you have a mechanism like the commissioner's exempt list. And we didn't end up seeing it in the Antonio Brown situation, but that probably would have been a use for it then too. Just when those type of charges are pending the resolution of the civil case, criminal case, whatever you want to call it, that's why you have the commissioner's exempt list. So if I was a betting man, which Dan, you know that I am, I would bet that the armed robbery case is a perfect use for the commissioner's exempt list.
Yeah, no doubt. I agree with you wholeheartedly on that, and it may not take that long. I think the question of when, the timing question, you have to look at the flip side of it. If Roger Goodell places both players on the list right now, and then in a month or a month and a half, the prosecutor declines to move forward with the case, you've basically pulled the rug out from under both players and deprived them of an entire training camp and basically put them behind the 8 ball for the start of the regular season. So I suspect that Commissioner Goodell may be waiting a couple of weeks to see at least what happens in the criminal case pending in Broward County. But we also have to bear in mind that players are paid their salaries on a weekly basis during the NFL regular season. So putting the player on the paid leave list today is really of no moment financially, because the first game check won't be earned until September. They're not being paid now, other than, I guess, a per diem or a stipend. But this does beg the question, why should it take an actual game for a player, for that to be the dividing line on putting a player on the exempt list? They're acting as ambassadors ambassadors of the team right now. They are representing their respective franchises, whether it's a practice, a preseason game. They are representing those teams in public. And if you're going to use or going to have a commissioner's exempt list, I don't think you wait until week 1. I think you do it now, because they are actually working and performing their duties as a member of their respective football teams. And the paid leave prevents a player not only from playing in the game, but it also prohibits a player from practicing. So Roger Goodell is going to have a very difficult decision here as to the timing of when to place both players on the list. And I think he's looking for some indication from the state attorney's office as to whether they're going to move forward with their criminal case. But I don't know how much longer the commissioner could wait, because it's an embarrassment to the league to have 2 players accused of armed robbery involving the use of a firearm, serious felony charges, suiting up to practice, play an exhibition game, or play a regular season game. I think the time is now to make that kind of a decision.
I think we will see that one. We'll see that one out. Now, Dan, normally we have another NFL topic that's on deck, but Dan told me I could mix and match. So I'm gonna throw us for a little bit of a wild card here. Switching sports, Dan. I think it's time to talk about my favorite story this past week, the Buffalo Blue Jays. Dan, this past couple months, we have not had a lot of fun sports stories. It is stories like sports getting canceled all over the place. So maybe not a fun story if you lived in Toronto. As we saw this past week or so, the Toronto, the country of Canada did not want to allow the baseball players to be able to go in and out of country lines, because just, objectively, United States is getting hit with COVID much harder than Canada is. So I think that makes sense why Canada waited, so close to the season. I'm not sure, but, neither here nor there. We are at a point where Toronto Blue Jays had to pick a new form. So the guys as big as Jeff Passan, Bob Nightingale, we're talking about Dunedin, Florida, or Buffalo. Those look like the 2 logical options, both affiliates within the Jays organization. I know people were talking about, those 2 as the main frontrunners. So all of a sudden, for whatever reason, Toronto started to look at Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh looked like the site. There was many verified accounts saying that Pittsburgh was a done deal. And all of a sudden, in the words of Lee Corso, not so fast, my friend. The Department of Health, Pennsylvania, stepped in and they said, we do not want another baseball team playing in PNC Park. And that left the Blue Jays as free agents without a home stadium when games had already started, Dan. We already had an opening night of baseball. And guess what, Dan? I'm going to give myself a little bit of credit. I've said throughout this, I used a quote from another guy I know, Thanos, shout out to Thanos, that it was inevitable that the Buffalo Blue Jays would be a thing. And then all of a sudden, I got my wish. Buffalo Blue Jays happened. So, Dan, first, a shout out to Jordan Goldenberg for the idea for this topic. Obviously, I near and dear Buffalo Blue Jays to my heart. What are your thoughts overall on the Buffalo Blue Jays situation?
Well, I think it saved from Major League Baseball and the country from the unsightly image of 2 Major League Baseball teams in the city of Pittsburgh. I mean, I could see 2 in New York, 2 in Chicago, but not 2 in Pittsburgh. And it would also
sorry to our Pittsburgh fans, by the way. That's not me saying that.
But no. But more seriously, it would relegate potentially the Pittsburgh Pirates to the second best team in the city. And I think they'd be overshadowed possibly by the Blue Jays. If we're going to give Pittsburgh another franchise, I think we need to give them an NBA team, not a second Major League Baseball team. I don't think this is such a humongous sports law story. I think right now we're in a mad scramble. COVID-19 has wreaked havoc with every major professional sports league. And this is almost like a MASH unit just trying to cross the finish line. So I think it's going to make for a nice public interest story to have 3 Major League Baseball teams now in New York State for the first time since 1957, when we had the Brooklyn Dodgers, the New York Giants, and the New York Yankees. Unfortunately, I don't think there's going to be any Duke, Willie, or Mickey, analogies made, but I think it's pretty cool that New York State now has 3 teams for the first time in 63 years.
So, Dan, I will just leave you this. Let's skip the tables. Okay, number 3, Dan. Well, I think it's a fun story just because Buffalo, I mean, my law firm is based, Goldberg Segala is based out of Buffalo. So I grew up as a Bills fan. I'm not sure why I grew up as a Bills fan, but I have a JP Lozman jersey. I have a Rob Johnson jersey. These are quarterbacks no one will have ever heard of because they were absolute busts in the NFL. But I grew up a Bills fan. I'm not sure why, but I root for the city of Buffalo whenever I can. And I said Jordan Goldberg. It's Jordan Goldstein recommended the topic, and I wanted to make sure I got that one right. So
I almost became a big Buffalo fan. I was slated to go to the University of Buffalo, State University of New York at Buffalo. I made my father drive up 10 hours from Long Island to go to Buffalo. I took one look at the campus. I said, Dad, let's just head home. And I ended I ended up going to Albany instead. But I remember
you're offending the city of Pittsburgh and now Buffalo. You got 2 people on your Billy Madison list now. Two big jurisdictions.
Well, no one would be as victimized as my father was, having to do an 18-hour, 20-hour round trip. But I love Buffalo.
I think UV is beautiful. Okay, so Buffalo, don't come after me. Go after the other Dan.
In retrospect, it might have been a mistake because I ended up staying at Albany for only 2 years and then transferred to ultimately go back to school right around the block from my house. So maybe, looking at it with the benefit of 2020 hindsight, Buffalo could have been the way to go. So anyway, we're up to our next topic, Dan. Since you scrambled things up, I'll let you pick our next one.
Let's go back to the order. We'll go back to a football story. So this one was recommended. It's really Jamal Adams, the one-time Jet who made a lot of headlines. Now,
I was the one who recommended that.
Well, I was going to say, Dan, that the Conduct Detrimental account recommended that, who we know is run by our friend Mike Lawson. And the reason I was going to say, Dan, that the Conduct Detrimental account recommended that topic was because this involves a story of Conduct Detrimental. And Dan, tell us the intersection between Jamal Adams and Conduct Detrimental.
Well, the intersection between Jamal Adams, Woody Johnson, and Anthony Davis, to put an even finer point on it. Now, Jamal Adams has taken a very unusual path to forcing his way off of a team. In the NBA, Anthony Davis publicly requested a trade. But that's not how you do things in the NFL, because in the NFL, there are no trades. There are very few trades. So you have to take it one step beyond. And Jamal Adams, I think, can write the book on the way to force your way off of a team. He insulted the coach, the general manager, and the team owner.
Call that a trifecta in horse racing, but keep going.
Yeah, you're Jamaling your way off the team. He said about Adam Gase, the head coach, that he doesn't feel like that he's the right leader. He called Joe Douglas, the general manager, a liar. And then with respect to Woody Johnson, and we know we're going to get into Woody's situation in a second, but he allegedly made racist comments and sexist comments that really go over the line. And about Woody Johnson, Jamal Adams said, well, we need the right people at the top. Wrong is wrong. So in one fell swoop, he went after the coach, the GM, and the team owner, probably deservedly. But what struck me as unusual from a sports law perspective is that when you look at the NBA takes they toe the line on players making public trade demands or requests. About year and a half ago, Anthony Davis was fined $50,000 by the NBA for conduct detrimental to the NBA and to the teams.
You said the name of the podcast.
Yeah, well, I'm going to do it a lot of times today. This is we're going to get into.
I keep pointing it out. I got to keep you on your toes.
I mean, when we're talking about the NFL CBA, every third sentence contains the word conduct detrimental. So if we're going to fine me or have money associated with each time I say, there it is again, conduct detrimental, I think one of us will be able to retire. So Davis was fined $50,000 by the league simply for asking for a trade. More recently, Dwayne Dedmon was fined $50,000 by the NBA simply for publicly requesting a trade. The NFL, on the other hand, has players not just requesting trades, but going much further than that and doing everything humanly possible and saying anything possible, even going beyond the line, beyond the pale, just to get themselves traded. Yet the NFL doesn't step in and the teams don't step in to consider discipline in that case. And I know both the NFL and the teams have remedies and recourse under various contractual arrangements. The standard player contract gives the team the right to fine and suspend the player for up to 4 weeks for conduct detrimental to the team. And the NFL's collective bargaining agreement mentions the word conduct detrimental, maybe not every third line, but there are at least 17 references to conduct detrimental in the new CBA and in the old CBA as well. And it gives the commissioner quite a wide berth and wide latitude in suspending or fining a player for conduct detrimental to the NFL or to the game of professional football. So, Dan, why is the NBA taking a really tight line, drawing a really tight line on public trade requests, but the NFL, despite all of that power under the CBA and the standard players contract, are doing absolutely nothing about players who are spouting off like Jamal Adams?
It's a good question. I mean, we may not know the reasoning, but we know that at least in the NBA, there are just far fewer trades. So maybe they just deal with this less. There wasn't always this amount of mechanisms to prevent it in the NBA, but there was enough talk of collusion, enough talks about, I'm not going to say player empowerment, there's anything wrong with it, but player empowerment is much more present in the NBA than it is in the NFL. And I think just, interesting, Anthony Davis is going to the Lakers. The guy that started the player empowerment era is LeBron James. And this is with the decision, we just had our 10-year anniversary of it recently. I don't necessarily necessarily think, Dan, that there's anything really going on that's so different between what's happening with Jamal Adams and what happened with Anthony Davis. I just know that it's not that common in football. So for those that weren't paying attention to the trade, I said it was a mega deal. Jamal Adams goes to the Seahawks. In exchange, the Jets get a first-round pick in 2021, a third-round pick in 2021, and a first-round pick in 2022. So to Dan's point, I don't think the Seahawks expect Jamal Adams to be suspended or anything like that if they're giving up so much draft capital to get a player, obviously, at the top of his game. In theory, he's done the book of forcing his way out of town. Maybe there should be a punishment coming. Maybe that type of conduct, detrimental, should not go unpunished. But again, without some type of clear precedent, I can't think of any player that's done this. It's going to be tough. And just to point out, Dan and I were talking offline, Trent Williams with the Washington Redskins had the same type of issue. He wasn't really feeling so comfortable with the Redskins staff. He didn't call out the owner and the coach. He was very clear that he was demanding a trade. And there's a player on the Jaguars who's still going through this. That's Yannick Ngakoue. He's trying to get off the team. He really wants to, but there's no mechanism that could force him off. So Trent Williams got his trade. It only took a year. He missed basically the whole season, and Ngakoue is still there. So, Dan, I tend to think that this is something that the NFL maybe, possibly, should have included in the CBA, but, it was not dealt with.
Well, everything is in the CBA. Whatever Roger Goodell construes to be conduct detrimental is part of the CBA. If we learned anything from Deflategate, Adrian Peterson, and Ezekiel Elliott's ill-fated litigations, is that the commissioner can construe the CBA almost as elastically as he wants to, and the courts will not disturb that. And, whether it's right or wrong legally and whether it's upheld in the courts, I'm looking at this from the vantage point of competitive integrity and, I guess, the sanctity of contract. This might be one of the few times that I will not reflexively side with players, because I'm certainly, sympathetic to the fact that players really don't have guaranteed contracts in the NFL and that the system is really unfairly skewed against them. But if a player like Jamal Adams is able to get away with this, what's to stop the next player and the next player and the next player? And what that does is it impairs the team's ability to trade him, and the teams in a catch 22. If they suspend him or fine him, they devalue him even further. So there's got to be some way for the NFL to intercede to maybe start to set examples of, at the very least, fining players for that kind of conduct. But if $50,000 is not going to dissuade Anthony Davis, well, what's $50,000 going to do to someone like Jamal Adams, who earns in the neighborhood of several million per year? So it's a really different situation.
The only thing that I would add, it's not, it is in the CBA, but it's also not in the CBA, because in the NBA CBA, which I had to dig through closely with the Kawhi Leonard situation, it's pretty clear what tampering entails. It is and it isn't, but there's a very clear tampering provision. And maybe that's why it's punished more. But you could call conduct detrimental, and this is the name of the podcast. I guess it's an amorphous term. It can apply to a lot of things. But maybe you would have been better served if you were the NFLPA getting a particular area that you kind of know exactly what this punishment is for a player or lack thereof when it comes to, I don't know if it's necessarily tampering, it's comments to try to design to try to get you off the team. So, I don't think the lack of clarity does anyone any favors in this regard.
Yeah, is there any doubt that we chose the right name for our podcast? The Dan Wallach Show, the Dan Lust Show, Dan and Dan wouldn't work. Conduct detrimental is just perfect. We joke about, oh, there you go, you said the name again, or you said the word again. There will not be an episode in our history where the word conduct detrimental does not come up at least once, because it is seeped in to almost the public jargon, the CBAs. It is like part and parcel to professional sports as much as the games themselves are. So I think we've chosen the perfect name. So there we go. We fleshed out the Jamal Adams situation. Now we turn to the related topic of what to do with Woody Johnson. Woody allegedly made some really outrageous racist and sexist statements in his role, I guess, privately when he's in the United Kingdom. He's Donald Trump's handpicked ambassador to the United Kingdom, and he supposedly made some really awful remarks about wondering why there was even a Black History Month and perpetuating the stereotype about Black fathers not remaining with their families. Let's assume, before we even assume what's true or what's not true, Dan, what do you think the NFL should be doing here?
Dan, if the Robert Kraft situation is any type of precedent for this, I think you got to hold off, and you have to wait to see what shakes out. We're obviously not in the court of law, but I'm a big believer in this, innocent until proven guilty. The Zion Williamson case, Twitter was ready to convict him when the charges came in, and I don't think that's fair. So even Woody Johnson, the comments might be disgusting, but they're just sources at this point. It's not like he's caught on tape saying them. So if that's what comes out, I think the NFL might have to act, might make some type of punishment. Owners are not immune from punishment, as we saw in the Jim Irsay situation not so long ago. But from the NFL, I'm waiting to see until possibly there is some confirmation of these statements.
Well, I think that's the problem. The NFL is kind of laying everything at the feet of the State Department and saying, well, we're not going to do anything right now. The NFL referred all media inquiries to the State Department. Well, what's the State Department going to be doing about this? Johnson is Trump's preferred ambassador. There's no CBA within the State Department where there's a disciplinary system. Woody Johnson's not going anywhere. And in the last 3 or 4 days since the announcement of these alleged statements, there's just been, no further coverage. I'm not aware of any State Department investigation, and this thing is just going to blow over and be forgotten about. And when you look at these alleged statements, they go considerably beyond anything that Donald Sterling said, and we know what happened to Donald Sterling, and they go considerably beyond the email that Bruce Levinson sent when he was, I guess, a minority owner or maybe majority owner of the Atlanta Hawks. And in both those situations, Sterling may not have been forced to sell by the NBA, but his conduct and his racist remark captured on audio tape basically set the wheels in motion for his wife to initiate a probate court proceeding, basically challenging his capacity and competency. And the result, or the court ruling in that probate court decision, ultimately led to a forced sale to Steve Ballmer, which set the new standard for franchise sales, topping $2 billion. But both those owners went away, and the respective leagues did not have to take any actual disciplinary action and invoke their constitutions or bylaws to force a sale. It happened through either other legal proceedings or behind the scenes maneuvering to try to persuade, at least in the case of Bruce Levinson, to sell his interest. And Bruce, to his credit, came forward and self-reported himself. So you have situations where Levinson's remarks were captured in an email, where Sterling's comments were captured on audio tape. But with Woody Johnson, there's no tape, no video, no email. There's just witnesses. I think there are at least 3 witnesses who claim that he made those statements, but there's nothing caught on tape. So I think the NFL needs to step in here and at least initiate an investigation, because what we're seeing is that, historically, the league does not wait before commencing investigations when it comes to player conduct or player misconduct, but it becomes almost like a two-sided, justice scale. And when the owners are the ones in similar situation, the NFL pulls its punches. And we talked last week about Dan Snyder and these allegations of sexual harassment and a toxic workplace. Well, the NFL is not investigating that. And it doesn't appear as if the NFL is investigating what Woody Johnson may or may not have said. So, do we have a double standard here, Dan?
Was that a rhetorical question? Because
yes.
100% we do. So, even as something as simple as, Bob Kraft's, trip to his own controversy, maybe that would get an NFL player cut from a team. But meanwhile, for Bob Kraft, there's nothing. And I think it's important to note the reason it makes sense that it's a double standard, and I'm not defending it, but the boss gets to make the rules to some extent. He gets to have a little bit more leeway. So something that the boss does, it might kind of roll off and then end up in no punishment. And if the player does it, they could get kicked off the team. So you can imagine if there was a hit and run like the Aldrich Rosas situation that we're talking about. I don't know if an NFL owner, anything would necessarily happen. I mean, maybe they'd happen to get the Jim Irsay treatment where they'd get suspended for 6 games, get fined. I think he was fined $500,000. But he remained on the team. I think there's that. So I think it's important for the John situation. You bring up a really good point. With Donald Sterling, that whole thing took off the second Sterling was caught on tape. And then all of these skeletons started to come out of his closet, and that tied together years worth of controversy. And it was now on tape. That was the smoking gun.
Well, he was always a racist. He was always a racist. I mean, this was not a revelation.
But that was the one thing that I think I was just about to say. Ray Rice, had that incident. The incident, got much bigger once it was put on tape and and everyone saw what happened in the elevator.
Bingo.
So there's kind of this launching moment that happened around Sterling and around Rice once this recording came out. So that's what I think the NFL is looking for. I don't expect them to have any action until something like that comes out.
Well, strange. You said that the owners, may get the benefit of the doubt or treated differently. The rules are the same. The personal conduct policy and the concept of conduct detrimental, the league has the power to discipline team owners, employees, league employees, team employees, players, coaches, Everyone comes under the umbrella of the personal conduct policy. And it isn't a case where the rules are different, but I think this is, and for all of our law students and practicing lawyers, especially those who practice in the area of civil rights litigation in Section 1983, there's a notion of something called selective enforcement. And it appears to me that the NFL is treating owners and executives on a somewhat on a softer basis and with more deference than they are treating the players. And I wonder whether at some point, the NFLPA or some player in defending against a disciplinary proceeding is going to utilize or invoke the selective enforcement defense, because the more that the NFL, just allows these owners to, I wouldn't say to get away with if the league is giving the owners a pass or delaying investigations or not even conducting an investigation at all, it does beg the question as to whether there is an institutional selective enforcement, and that could very well be utilized by an attorney representing an accused player, because it just stands out as being so obvious. Because you would think that for something as awful as what was said allegedly by Mr. Johnson, or the toxic culture that allegedly exists within the Washington NFL team, that if you're going to have a textbook case for a league investigation being mandated, it would be those two cases. And if those two cases don't merit it, then what does? Is an owner going to have to murder somebody? I mean, is that the baseline? I
would hope not, but I think, Dan, the point that I would hope it wouldn't take that far. But the point that you're hitting on is a good one that has come up, over the years in every type of situation. Dan, when you're saying, that the league is not doing X or the league is not doing Y, you are saying Roger Goodell is not doing X or not doing Y. And who gets to control if Roger Goodell has his job? That's the 32 NFL owners. Yeah, so when you and I were sitting here scratching our heads, and we cut that really fun clip. Like at the end of the day, it doesn't make any sense to me that the NFL is deferring to Beth Wilkinson's investigation into the Redskins as whether or not they're going to punish the team at all. What Dan Snyder hires Beth Wilkinson. Beth Wilkinson gets to do her report, and the NFL is deferring to that, which makes objectively no sense. It should be completely independent, but it does make a lot of sense if Goodell and the NFL don't want to anger Dan Snyder, who might have a lot of control behind the scenes. Same goes for Woody Johnson. Same goes for Bob Kraft. The second the owners then grab their pitchforks and go after the owners, you've opened up a window where you've created a precedent where an owner could get kicked out, lose their team. I mean, Dan, you and I spoke about this offline. There is, of course, a legal mechanism for an owner to have their team forced to be sold. It's just unprecedented. And then, I did my research. Marge Schott, who had her own issues, she wasn't forced to sell her team because she sold it, just voluntarily. She probably could have been forced under the.
But she was banished from the game for a while.
But she could have held the league hostage. But unless they went to go force that provision, no one's really ever had to do it because. Owners don't want to create that legal precedent. Not to say it's not there and not to say it won't happen. Owners will be remiss to hire somebody like that's not going to have their interests, like Roger Goodell. Same reason that Dan Snyder's hiring Beth Wilkinson, because the understanding is that she's not going to have an adverse finding against them because she's not going to have a job. She's not going to get hired by an NFL team after that. So, yeah, I think it's not really a rhetorical point. There is a double standard, but the double standard makes sense the way the NFL set up.
Well, I could see the delay in the case of the Washington Redskins because there were victims, there were privacy issues, and there is an investigation being done by the team, and that does not forestall or prevent the league from eventually doing their own. But to me, there's no excuse for the NFL to take a pass on investigating racist statements allegedly made by by one NFL team owner in multiple situations. I mean, if you read the quotes that are attributed to Woody Johnson and you just substitute Donald Sterling's name, it becomes a no-brainer. So I'd like to see the NFL at least initiate something. So I guess we'll see. We'll time will tell, and hopefully we'll see some action on this, and we'll revisit this situation down the line and conduct detrimental. So turning the gavel or spinning the wheel to our next topic, Dan. I mixed my metaphors. We have a couple of topics left. We're gonna. I don't want to race through them, but which ones do you think we should tackle next?
I'm interested to see how you can spin a gavel, like spinning a basketball like that. That's pretty cool. That's pretty talented. Okay, Dan, let's I want to make sure that we leave enough time for this one. It's near and dear to your heart. We've hit a couple football ones in a row. So I'm going to skip on our chart. Just quickly, I want to get this one out to number 4 on our list, Dan. Just quickly, it's not necessarily a sports law issue, but to the extent that freedom of speech is involved here, I think it's just important to kind of hit on. We had a return this week, in addition, baseball coming back. Adrian Wojnarowski made his return to Twitter. This topic was suggested by Megha Patel, who's a law student over at Memphis Columbus Law School. I think when Woj first made those comments, he dropped what I call the Woj F-bomb. Someone sent, I don't want to give any credit out, but he dropped the Woj F-bomb in a company email in response to a political message that was targeted at ESPN's treatment and maybe censorship of their NBA reporters. So Woj probably, and he obviously regrets it now, just responded to that and dropped an F-bomb at this politician. So, Woj, people were wondering what was going to happen. Woj is a very high individual in the NBA. Woj ended up getting suspended. So, Dan, what are your thoughts overall on, maybe I should give you a little bit more background. I think, at least my take on Woj, it's First Amendment has protections in a lot of different places. In a public forum, you're allowed to protest, you're allowed to do certain things. But when you're using a company email and you're responding in your capacity as a company employee, the First Amendment doesn't afford you those same protections, and it doesn't allow you full immunity from punishment. So I understood why ESPN punished. I mean, at the end of the day, I think it kind of amounts to a slap on the wrist. The NBA is not back yet. So to lose Woj for 2 weeks when the NBA is literally not playing, I don't really think is that big of a deal. What are your overall thoughts on it?
Well, I think it's a reflection of the reality that 50% of the country finds, Woj's comments to be contrary to what they believe. We live in a very politically divisive country, as reflected by the presidential votes in 2000 and 2016. And maybe ESPN, if he gave them truth serum, wouldn't have wanted to suspend Woj. But I think given the political climate that we were in, they were almost faced with no choice, because to not suspend him would have probably left a bad taste in the mouths and minds of a significant part of ESPN's audience that may actually not like what he said to the Congress person. And those of us, I'm not meaning us like me or you, but those that support Woj and believe he has the right to say those things, I don't think we view ESPN's action as going over the line. He agreed to it. He accepted responsibility and expressed regret, and no one is begrudging ESPN their decision to suspend Woj for 2 weeks. But had they not suspended him, it would have led to a huge outcry that ESPN is showing political bias towards, against Republican issues and in favor of liberal issues. And a network like ESPN can't be perceived, even if it's not a legitimate perception, they can't be perceived as having their thumbs on the scale politically, because it's just going to drive away, viewers and listeners. And part of what's driven a lot of the NFL action around the reluctance to sign Colin Kaepernick, because the moment Kaepernick comes into a training camp or assigned to a contract, you're turning off 20 to 30% of your fan base. I don't think that's a legitimate reason not to sign him, but that is the economic reality of the situation. So in the end, Woj's suspension wasn't all that controversial, because the inverse of that, not suspending him, would have led to a far greater outcry and kept this story in the news for weeks and months longer.
So, Dan, on that, we didn't talk about this, but another big story in the sports world, we'll say sports, quasi-sports, similar concept. Over at Barstool Sports, Dave Portnoy made the call to interview Trump. So I know that was cause for some concern within Barstool, because they've always, or at least some people, had the notion that Barstool was they had no political concept, so they tried not to hit political issues. And meanwhile, Dave Portnoy, who's the head of the company, makes the call that he wants to interview Trump. So I think that's, you've hit it. It's not really necessarily a legal topic. I find it really interesting. It's a business decision at the end of the day, and power to him, but I think it's going to cost, one or the other. You do tend to alienate your listeners when you hit politics one or the other. And that's why, Dan, on Conduct Detrimental, we don't talk about politics. We talk about sports.
Well, I think if you read between the lines and you're denizens of the show, you can probably figure out my politics in 15 minutes or 15 seconds or less. But the point is, I don't allow that to shade any of the issues that we talk about, which are legal topics affecting sports. This is not a public affairs show. This is not a Republicans versus Democrats related issue. So regardless of what teams I root for, regardless of who I vote for in an election, I think the debate surrounding the intersection of law and sports, I wouldn't say it's totally apolitical, but we're analyzing the law and enlightening, at least hopefully enlightening our audience on some of the legal aspects of the sports issues that they follow. So you mentioned Barstool. The interesting thing about Barstool, which segues into our final topic, is that Barstool is now under the Penn National Gaming umbrella.
An excellent segue, Dan.
Yeah,
Keep
yeah.
going.
So
Excellent segue.
Barstool is now affiliated with a gambling company, and gambling companies are very tightly regulated. They're subject to oversight by state gambling authorities, and the one thing that gambling companies abhor is controversy. And anything that could call into question their good standing for licensure, because in order to have a sports book and to have a casino, you got to have a gambling license. And getting a gambling license entails a significant amount of vetting as to an applicant's suitability, as well as the suitability of many of their key employees. And I can understand why Penn National wanted to acquire Barstool Sports, because Penn National was not a brand that many outside of the gambling industry really knew. It's one of the largest regional it is the largest regional casino operator in the country, but it doesn't have the name recognition of a Caesars or an MGM. So acquiring Barstool Sports basically gave them the ability to brand a Barstool Sportsbook, and the advent of sports betting legalization in the United States was the catalytic event that led to the acquisition of Barstool by Penn National. So now you have Dave Portnoy, who is a marketing genius. Whether you love him, hate him, I think everything is a work. Like if we're going to use a wrestling reference, this is all a work. And Dave Portnoy has a public persona, and he plays it to the hilt. And he does a very good job of playing that persona, but I think he's crossed a lot of lines recently, racial lines. And that's not a good look for Penn National, because, if you recall, Steve Wynn had to give up his position and his stock ownership of Wynn Resorts based upon, this, long-term or lengthy history of sexual misconduct allegations. And the Massachusetts Gaming Commission almost did not grant a license to the new Wynn Encore in Boston, Massachusetts. So sexual harassment, the way a company conducts itself in the public forum, is fair grounds for licensing suitability. So Dave Portnoy's pushing of the envelope on the racial front could cause some complications for a company like Penn National Gaming that doesn't want to see any of its gambling licenses called into question, or to have disciplinary proceedings or any kind of disciplinary actions, fines, or delicensing affecting its ability to operate as a casino or as a sports book, which brings us to the state of Massachusetts, which gave birth to Barstool Sports.
So I just want to give credit where credit's due. Dan, you've been all over this on Twitter, talking about the new potential sports betting legislation in Massachusetts. Lucas Stroud, another law student, also recommended this. So Dan, why don't you get us into what maybe, possibly, could be legalization on the horizon in Massachusetts?
Yeah, sure. But I think we had two of our fans pitch the topic. Minnesota lawyer who used to be with Major League Baseball,
Tarun Sharma.
Ding, ding, ding. Tarun Sharma also asked for that topic, if memory serves me right. So during COVID-19, sports have largely been, shut down, and as a result, sports betting has really been relegated to some of the margins and marginal sports like ping pong and Belarusian soccer. And
why are you marginalizing ping pong?
I'm terrible at it. My wife beats me at ping pong religiously, so I'm not. I don't like to compliment ping pong.
And you don't need a third category of people coming after you after this.
Sure. But with COVID-19, not only have sports abated, but legislatures have largely been unable to carry forward their legislative business. Laws aren't being passed. So now that we're coming out of the darkness, so to speak, and returning to normal, at least with sports, I think a number of legislatures are moving forward with online gambling legislation and sports betting legislation. The one lesson of COVID-19 is that it underscores the importance of having a mobile product, because as patrons, fans, and those who visit casinos and racetracks are now a little bit more reluctant to leave their houses, it does underscore the need to have a remote way of gambling. And this is where the Massachusetts legislature is answering the dreams and answering the call of all those citizens of the Commonwealth who want to have legal sports betting. Over the past year, New Hampshire and Rhode Island have introduced a mobile sports betting product product, and we've all been waiting for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts to weigh in because all these residents are driving across state lines to place bets in Rhode Island and New Hampshire, and it really begged the question of why isn't the state legislature or the Massachusetts legislature moving quickly here and introducing a new bill to legalize sports betting? Well, your prayers were answered Friday morning as part of a new economic development package, aka a jobs bill. Tucked into that measure is a sports betting bill, which in my opinion, and I've been following this area for the last 7-8 years, it is the most sports industry friendly sports gambling bill that has been introduced to date. Part of the problem that the leagues and the teams have been facing in a lot of different state legislatures is that their lobbying influence is not as strong as that of the casino industry, because the casino industry, has been dealing, with the lobbyists and lobbying for new laws for time immemorial. And the leagues and the teams are largely strangers to the state legislative process. So in the ensuing battles over whether there's going to be an integrity fee or official league data or any of the major league asks, for the most part, the casino industry has won that battle in almost every state. Massachusetts may represent a turning point in that debate because introducing the most sports industry friendly bill of any that has been introduced in the 2+ years of the post-PASPA era, we have a bill that has an integrity fee. Not for the leagues, not for the NBA, the PGA, or Major League Baseball, but one that is specific to venues, and it imposes a 1% excise tax on gross gaming revenues associated with the games played at Massachusetts sports venues, meaning, for games that are played at Fenway Park, in Foxborough, at the TD Garden, all the wagers placed on games played in those venues, the gambling companies are going to have to pay a 1% excise tax on gross gaming revenues directly to the venue operators. So this is a gift for Robert Kraft, John Henry, the owner of the Celtics, whose name I can't pronounce, Wyke, and for Jeremy Jacobs of the Bruins. So you have an integrity fee. You have a first of its kind provision in the Massachusetts bill that explicitly allows the sports leagues to enter into revenue sharing agreements with the sports gambling operators without requiring the leagues to go out and get gambling licenses. In almost every state where there's a revenue share, if you're sharing in any of the gambling revenues, almost every state gambling law or regulation will require the recipient of a revenue share to go out and get a gambling license. That's the case in New Jersey. That's the case in Mississippi, and probably the case in Nevada. Massachusetts carves out the leagues from that requirement and allows teams like the NBA and Major League Baseball to basically structure their data deals or their rights deals and potentially secure a piece of the action. And that's something that the leagues have been gunning for in a number of different jurisdictions to no avail. But now this is being introduced in a very novel way on the team level, and it speaks to the lobbying influence of the Celtics, the Patriots, and the Red Sox in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, where the legislative offices are in the same city as where the teams play. And that's the first of its kind. I mean, most state legislatures, meet in cities that are not the major metropolitan centers. Here in Boston, you have the city, you have the legislators and the teams basically being in the same mix. And let's face it, these teams have been winning a significant number of championships. The Patriots, the Red Sox, the Celtics, the Bruins, around 10 years ago, those teams have tremendous goodwill and allegiance within the city. And if there was going to be any market where the sports industry would come out on top, at least with respect to these asks, I would say Massachusetts is the most obvious place for the leagues and the teams to win that lobbying battle. And along the same lines, before we wrap up, there are several other benefits given to the sports industry. Okay, we talked about the integrity fee, we talked about the revenue sharing opportunities, but the leagues are also being given real-time bet monitoring ability accountability, which means that the sports gambling operators could be required to share their account level betting data in real time, not just with the Gambling Commission, but with the sports leagues upon demand. That is one of the few times the leagues have been successful in securing that kind of right. Going beyond that, there's also a mandate that the gambling companies utilize the league's official data for all in-game wagers. That's going to become a tremendous revenue opportunity for the teams and for the leagues. And what differentiates this official league data requirement is that it applies to all in-game wagers, even those that pertain to the final score. In a number of other jurisdictions like Tennessee and Illinois that have legislated official league data mandates, they only extend it to in-game bets pertaining to player propositions and anything else besides the final score. In Massachusetts, the final score is included within the OLD mandate. And then last but not least, even the players associations get a piece of the action. The new Massachusetts bill creates a players benevolent fund, which has earmarked towards it 1% of the state's collections from licensing fees and GGR taxation. 1% of that boatload of money is going to be earmarked to this players development fund for distribution to player charities that emphasize youth sports, concussions, and the decision makers for that distribution will be the members, or at least appointed members of the various professional sports players unions. So this could represent a major legislative shift on the map. And if this law or if this bill does get enacted, it will be truly the first one of its kind.
So I'm going to give you a quick shout, Dan, because I'm the only one that can see you on video here. When Dan talks about sports betting, his eyes light up. Like Dan has been called from a former guest of the podcast, Darren Ravel, the guru of sports betting. I said it. I saw the tweet. I know you're not going to call yourself that. Dan is obviously the expert on this. One thing that you brought up that I've just been curious about, I know you and I didn't talk about this. On the side, Dan, I'm the chair of my local bar association tech law committee. I'm very curious about the tech issues, the data privacy issues that are going on in these bubbles right now across sports. So just on the tech end, the tech people that are listening to this, in the NFL, there's a chip that they place in people's shoulder pads that will tell you, in essence, essentially who you came into contact with on a field. They're using it for COVID purposes to figure out who, contact tracing purposes, who you came into contact with. So that concept and that technology is essentially being put, that's what's in the NBA's, the ring, this titanium ring that they're going around, and they're going to try, or at least they're thinking about putting it in a watch on the NFL's concept. So that'll tell you in some shape or form who you came into contact with off the field. Now, Dan, the reason I bring that to you, this type of technology is a little bit more invasive, but it will tell you things such as, and if it's just being applied to its fullest extent, what someone's resting heart rate is, what their fatigue levels are. This level of invasive data is something that the NBA has never seen before. So the NBA and the NFL, I'm sure they're going to come up with their own version of it. NBA has said, we're just keeping this data for this year to monitor your health. So we're going to keep certain invasive private data on you to monitor your health, and we're going to delete it once the season's over. We don't need that information. So me just kind of issue spotting at a very high level. If I'm the NBA, I've played, video games my whole life. There's something called like a fatigue meter, right? You're familiar with the concept. You can't hit turbo the entire time because you'll see your guys' fatigue going down. So if you're playing FIFA, you're playing anything like that, you want to sub those guys out. So now in my head, I'm thinking there's someone in the back room that's going to be seeing on an NBA level what a guy's heart rate looks like during NBA gameplay. They're going to have access to that material. So me, Dan, and you mentioned something like this would be a tremendous revenue opportunity for these players long term. I'm wondering, if you being the sports betting guru, if you see that this data privacy and this private information, if the leagues try to make this part of this next maybe wave of CBA to try to increase another revenue round, because I know as an amateur gambler and I'm amateur bettor, that information, this fatigue level, that type of stuff would be so helpful to me for live in-game betting, anything like that, if I could see how the endurance levels, fatigue levels.
It's come up in every legislative discussion. The players' associations are claiming that this is, players' private information that shouldn't be, utilized or exploited by the league. I guess everything has a price, but right now that hasn't really seeped into the highest level of the debate, but it's really been part of the overall discussion. And the players' associations are sensitive to that issue when it comes to legislative bill drafting. And, I know from having personally attended attended and spoken and testified at some of these legislative hearings that representatives of the NFL.
Humble brag, Dan, but keep going.
Yeah. Representatives of the NFLPA have regularly testified as to that issue. So of the NHLPA and the MLBPA. So that's not a under the radar topic for them. That's sort of top of mind. And you're right. My eyes do light up when it comes to the topic of sports betting. I'm not here today on a podcast. I'm not even relevant on the issue of sports law if I didn't at least use sports betting as my first foray beyond the four walls of, my law office. I mean, I was an appellate lawyer for so many years, and sports betting was the very first thing I became known for in the public domain. And it is my favorite topic, and it is my livelihood. Not only do I teach it, but I have a law firm dedicated to the regulated sports wagering and gambling industry. So,
What's the name of that law firm, Dan? I forgot.
Coincidentally, it's called Wallach Legal LLC. And
it's not called Conduct Detrimental Law Firm, because that would
that came in second. So Dan, you're kind of, I'm not saying you're new to the topic, you're a gambler, but let's talk about the integrity fee for a second. This has become a legislative flashpoint in almost every state. Do you have an opinion one way or another as to whether the leagues should receive a more direct cut of the action, so to speak?
Do I have an opinion? No, I'm not so strong in it. I just, Dan, being from New York, I would love that if New York could legalize gambling sooner rather than later. But when it comes to who gets the money at the end of the day, no, I don't really have a strong opinion on that.
Well, we'll save that debate for another day. I'll tell you how I feel. I've been pretty public about it. I think it's not unreasonable for the leagues to share directly economically, in the economic upside of sports wagering. And that's not limited to sponsorship deals or trademark deals. That I'm talking about having a direct revenue share associated with the overall activity. Some people think it should be left to the commercial marketplace. Others think it should be legislatively enacted or mandated. And we're seeing it now mandated, at least in part in Massachusetts. And you mentioned New York. New York is one of the other states that has, at least so far, moved forward pretty dramatically and far along in granting the leagues a royalty and or integrity fee. So in rapid fire form, Massachusetts and New York can represent a pretty stark and dramatic 1-2 punch and maybe shift some of the legislative momentum back into the league's favor. They've been making a lot of progress, at least with respect to official league data, and that being baked into the legislation. And many have thought that, well, OLD is basically supplanting integrity fee as the major league ask. No, I think they're seeking both, and now they appear to be getting it in Massachusetts, at least on the team level and partially the league level, and then also getting it in the New York legislation. And later this summer, we may find out whether Governor Cuomo and whether the New York legislature can advance this across the finish line. So these are the two big states to watch out for in the month of August, and it's really going to be an exciting month for sports betting. The Northeast is well on its way to becoming the hub of sports betting nationally, with New Jersey, Pennsylvania, New York, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and the great state of Rhode Island. The map in the Northeast is essentially becoming a very sports betting centric, part of the country. So big things are happening in the Northeast when it comes to sports betting.
So I guess twofold, Dan. No one can see me on this podcast other than you, but my eyes are getting a lot bigger hearing that is a possibility. And you and I have spoken about this on other podcasts, and I've spoken about this, on social media. The COVID effect, I think, is going to increase these timeframes. Maybe even, Dan, just to go back to my earlier point.
Accelerate the timeframe.
Accelerate. So I think, Dan, it's going to increase the likelihood, is what I meant to say, of an expedited time frame for legalized gambling. And then maybe even, Dan, some of these concepts as to how the NBA can increase revenue with maybe some invasion of privacy concepts. But the NBA and Major League Baseball, NFL, they're not swimming in revenue right now. It's all hands on deck. So maybe that moves to the top of those priority lists.
Well, it's really become a major initiative for all the stakeholders in the gambling and sports industry. Sports betting has become one of the hot areas. Teams and all the leagues are now devoting entire teams and staffing around sports betting. There are now integrity officials relating to betting. There's, on the commercial side, executives that oversee all of sports betting. It's become a business division within each professional sports league. And now it's starting to get really serious when we think about cities like Boston and New York City being hubs for sports betting, while Massachusetts, in all likelihood, will pass their legislation. There are no obstacles like tribal compacts or state constitutions that would interfere with the progress of the Massachusetts bill. I would expect that to be signed into law or something similar. There could be a few amendments along the way, but I'm very optimistic that that will pass and Massachusetts residents will be able to legally bet on the Super Bowl in 2021. I've made that prediction now 3 years running. Eventually, one day I'm going to get it right. So they'll be able to bet on Cam Newton taking the Patriots to the Super Bowl and do that legally within their home state. New Yorkers, on the other hand, I think it's probably more likely than not that New Yorkers will have to cross the George Washington Bridge and go through the Lincoln Tunnel to bet in New Jersey, because New York's obstacles, at least the perceived obstacles, are a lot steeper because New York has a constitutional provision that does require a voter referendum for any type of gambling expansion. And there is a significant amount of debate over whether that constitutional amendment process is necessary. I'm of the view that it is not, because mobile betting is a subset of casino gambling, which has already been constitutionally approved. But that's a topic for another day. But there are some significant legislative and perceived legal obstacles that stand in the way of New Yorkers legally betting. So my prediction will be that Massachusetts, 99% likely, is going to be the first of those two states to enact a sports betting law.
Okay, so I will say I'm not going to let you off the hook on one thing that you said, Dan. You said that Patriots bettors can go bet on the Patriots with Cam Newton to win the Super Bowl. So just I listen to a lot of podcasts. I listen to the Cam Chronicles over on the Ringer podcast. Highly recommend it. I wasn't so sold if the Patriots were going to do anything with Newton, but I would recommend listening to that Cam Chronicles. I might throw some hypothetical money on the Patriots. Now, Dan, before we send us home, I wanted just quickly, you know me, I watch a lot of TV, I listen to a lot of podcasts. Recently, if you've been following me on Twitter, I talk a lot about Formula One racing, which I've got into just with the pandemic, there being no sports. And then similarly, this new sport that I've now kind of been dabbling in is the drone racing league. So if anybody is into F1 or the drone racing league, give me a shout. I am learning these very expeditiously. Dan, I don't take it that you're into either of those two sports.
No. Formula. I don't think I've ever been to a racing event, and I don't think I haven't watched a racing event since Mario Andretti, won the Indianapolis 500. So I'm not exactly a big fan, but it does underscore how popular you're starting to, get into it. Racing, NASCAR is, one of the most popular,
I don't know if I'm into NASCAR. NASCAR is like just turning left the whole time. I don't know if I'm into that, but Formula One is kind of cool. And Drone Racing League is like another animal. It's
that's going to be a major force integrating gambling. Sports betting is going to be a rising tide that lifts all boats, whether it's Formula One, NASCAR, soccer, tennis, golf. All these sports that are the so-called non-major fours are going to generate a lot more eyeballs on their games, more revenue opportunities, sponsorships. There's going to be more engagement because of sports betting. And, I know we're probably 6-7 episodes at least into our new partnership. And this may be the very first time that we've addressed the issue of sports betting at any great length. And I think given how nascent this field is and how many opportunities there are for jobs for so many of the law students who are on a sports law track, it might be a good element of our program, at least. It's something at least I know something about, that we can focus part of the show almost every week on, what's new in the area of legal or legislation surrounding sports betting.
So with that being said, Dan, I want to give a quick shout out. You and I have our first, we'll say, co-speaking engagement. That's with Florida International University. Josh Goldberg, the president of their sports law association, has us, the Conduct Detrimental tag team, as well as Darren Heitner for a Zoom session. All are open to attend. I'll throw that up on Twitter. I know Dan already has. That's August 4th, and I'm speaking to Tulane Law School in July, I think it's 29th, and that's Skylar Corbin. He's their speaker chair, so I'm going to be doing a Zoom with those guys. So we'll have the information on that on Twitter, Instagram, and wherever else you can find us.
August 10th, I'll be at Catch a Rising Star. August 12th, Dangerfield, and on August 17th, I'll be at Governor's in Levittown with 3 sets of comedy each night. No, I'm just kidding. There are no other appearances. August 4th is all I have on the docket. I'm really looking forward to that, Dan. That will be a lot of fun. And to all of our law students out there, we're going to be tweeting, that event, and we encourage you to sign up for it. It's free, and it should be a fun event. And
Dan, pandemic permitting, I think we have a plan to be somewhere in February.
Yes. Conduct Detrimental is going to the Super Bowl. We will be at Radio Row in Atlanta. A, if there's a Super Bowl. B, if there's a Radio Row. and see if there's any kind of in-person contact allowed within 6 feet. We will be manning a booth at Radio Row during the Super Bowl. So for all of you NFL players out there, coaches, celebrities,
all of them listen to this podcast.
Yes. If you want to get booked, contact either Dan or myself on Twitter. Here's my wish list: Lawrence Taylor, Phil Sims, Mark Favara, Bill Parcells. Do you see a theme here? Barry Beck. Yes. And by the way, we do have to end on a very sad note. And as a longtime Rangers fan, this was like a gut punch. A lot of us who are on Facebook have reconnected with Barry Beck, the great, very good, staunch, stalwart Rangers defenseman of the late 70s and early 80s. I thought he was a Hall of Fame caliber player, but it was just the wrong, situation. He got injured, separated his shoulder, and never came back. His son was murdered last night. So it threw a lot of us who've been friendly with Barry. And the word is just seeping out. This hasn't gotten a lot of attention yet. Barry's living in Hong Kong. He has one child. His name is Brock Beck, and he was murdered last night in Ontario, stabbed. The assailants are unknown. And, I know I speak for myself, but I probably speak for every Ranger fan and every fan of hockey, anyone who's ever come across Barry Beck in their life, whether watching him or knowing him. And, our heart goes out to Barry. And, I pray that there's justice for Brock Beck. And, I'm definitely feeling Barry Beck right now, somebody I admired and looked up to as a kid. And he's going through some really tough times right now. And losing a son, losing a member of your family, losing a child, there's nothing worse than that. So that's what's on my mind today. And I really, really pray for strength for Barry. And most importantly, if you have a chance to reach out to him on Facebook or send positive vibes. I mean, he definitely needs our support right now. He was certainly one of the real great Ranger captains, and as great of a captain as he is, as he was, he's an even better person to know, at least through his social media account and connecting with him all these years later. So, I pray for Barry and his family, and I hope they catch the killers.
A somber note to the end of Conduct Detrimental. In any event, that will do it for this week. We will see you next week. As always, Dan Wallach is on Twitter, Instagram at Wallach Legal. Myself, Dan Lust, Sports Law Lust on Twitter and Instagram, and the show Conduct Detrimental, but it's at Con Detrimental on Twitter and Instagram. So as always, if you have questions during the week, definitely feel free to reach out to us. Dan, DMs are open, same are mine, and we are we're pretty responsive. So whatever questions you have, you feel free to throw them at us. And Dan, before we send us home, you have anything left?
To those of you who stayed for the full hour plus, we thank you, and you will receive a medal.
And with that being said, we will see you next week for another episode of Conduct Detrimental.